a great pleasure for me today to be here with you, although the occasion is a very sad one. As you already said, Monica, 8 years have passed since the Rana Plaza tragedy. No other event has focused the public spotlight on so much on working conditions in the textile industry. So Rana Plaza was and still is considered a reference point. But as you already mentioned, for us also the big question remains, what has happened since then? What have we achieved in Germany? Which lessons learned did we draw from the tragic event? Because, you know, it would be even more dramatic if Rana Plaza has resulted in no action or insufficient action by the international community. To me, 4 elements come to my mind when thinking of Rana Plaza that I'd like to share with you. The first one is a sad one, because the fashion industry is unfortunately still part of the problem rather than part of the solution in a globalized world. Here are some shocking facts about the textile industry that I stumbled upon. So fashion industry makes up to 10% of humanity's carbon emissions. That's more carbon than international flights and maritime shipping combined. Textile dyeing is the world's second largest polluter of water, since the water left over from the dyeing process is often dumped into ditches, streams, or rivers. And 85% of all textiles go to the dump each year. And washing clothes, meanwhile, releases 500,000 tons of microfibers into the ocean each year, the equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. And I could go on and on and on, but how to tackle these challenges and come to sustainable solutions? I will come to that in a bit. My second point covers transparency, and you were already referring to that, Monica. We have very complex supply networks. We're not even talking about supply chains. These are networks, very complex, and most of the time very intransparent. So I believe that transparency is key for the real structural change on the ground. Having said that, the first prerequisite for businesses is to know their supply chain. I'm happy to have our colleague from Hess Natur here, and I'm pretty sure she will elaborate on that later as well. So the moment you know about your risks, you'll be able to take preventative measures in order to avoid or reduce negative impacts on human rights and the environment. That is why a risk-based approach is so important. It is not only a matter of business responsibility, it is also a matter of economic rationality. That is why we promote a risk-based approach and demand businesses to first identify the risks, but we also expect businesses to provide remedy in case of human rights violations. And I'm being very clear here on that point. And we expect them to implement a complaints mechanism accessible to potentially affected. Unfortunately, I witnessed that some businesses still see transparency as a burden. Instead, transparency in supply chain helps companies to optimize their processes and minimize risks. In the medium and long term, that helps to save costs and safeguard production. So a win-win situation for business as well as the employees. So we want made in Germany to mean not just top quality, but also top social and environmental standards. In order to tackle the challenges in these complex supply chains, we will need a smart mix, and I will use that term quite often today. A smart mix of voluntary and mandatory, as well as national and international measures. And that's my third observation. A smart mix means, in other words, that there are no quick fixes and no one-size-fits-all solutions. Instead, we all need to live up to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, which means that we need both binding rules for all and voluntary initiatives that go even further. So let me briefly elaborate on our German smart mix approach in the textile sector since 2013. After the tragic events of Rana Plaza, we started off with Siegelklarheit. That's a governmental platform which gives consumers orientation in a jungle of various certification marks. In 2014, we established the Partnership on Sustainable Textiles, a multi-stakeholder initiative which aims at fostering the social and environmental standards in the textile supply chain. In 2019, we introduced the Green Button, a government-run textile certification mark, which uniquely combines enterprise-related criteria with product-related criteria. This means that products can only be labeled with the Green Button if the company has proven the implementation of a robust due diligence management system. In just this year, recently, beginning of the year, we published government-wide guidelines to help administrations with the procurement of sustainable textiles. And back already in 2018, we started the monitoring of our National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. I'm sure you all know the results. They were very sobering. Less than 20% of the larger German companies committed to voluntary due diligence. And these results finally paved the way for our Draft Due Diligence Act, which was just recently passed by our cabinet and undergoes right now the parliamentary process. And I'm pretty confident, let me underline that we will pass the law this summer, maybe in the next weeks. The law will be applied with a sense of proportion. Let me elaborate on some key points of the draft law. The scope of due diligence will always depend on the influence a company can exert in a specific risk context. It applies to all sectors, and human rights due diligence will be compulsory for big companies in their own business as well as along their supply chain. This includes also environmental aspects if they have an effect on human rights, like contaminated drinking water. The law will initially apply to companies with more than 3,000 employees, and from 2024, it will apply to companies with more than 1,000 employees. The draft law introduces a gradual responsibility as well as a gradual scope of due diligence. It relates to the company's own business operations, to the activities of its direct suppliers, and to the activities of its indirect suppliers. It envisages strong enforcement by the authorities. The Federal Office for Export Control will check published reports and will apply sanctions if obligations are not being met. So companies that fail to comply with their due diligence obligations will face the threat of fines, and in case where there has been a major failure to comply, they may be excluded from participating in public procurement processes. So for the first time, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights will be comprehensively enshrined in law, and there will be a pragmatic approach to its implementation. In particular, reporting is to happen electronically and with as little red tape as possible. But compliance with due diligence, however, should not apply in Germany alone. We are working closely with the European Commission and are supporting its efforts as regards European regulations. Our goal is to create a harmonized European legislative framework. We are leading the way with the German law and are showing our neighboring countries that we are serious about this matter and convinced that due diligence legislation is necessary and useful. So you see, we came a long way, but still we're not there. Our proposal foresees that all companies that are based in Germany, that doesn't mean that they have to be German, but the companies that are based in Germany should be affected. And you know that we're still undergoing the parliamentary process. Maybe some changes could be added in that regard, that all companies that have their business in Germany should be included by the law. My minister and also the Minister of Labor, we came up with another proposal. We came up with a clear regulation on civil liability besides the ministry that looks at the reports. And unfortunately, we were not able let me put it that way. It was part of the political compromise that we didn't foresee civil liability in our proposal. But on the other hand, we have the European level that I was already referring to. And I think that's a good point to bring it to a European level to pave the way for a level playing field for all companies in Europe. So just because it's not foreseen in the German law doesn't necessarily mean that we will fight for it on the European level. We have a very close cooperation with the EU Commission on the one hand, that we're very much supporting with their legislative initiative that will hopefully soon come. But on the other hand, we have close cooperation with like-minded member states, be it France, be it Netherlands, or the Scandi colleagues. So the cooperation is very close because the worst thing that could happen is that we have a fragmentation of standards and different ideas of every member state on how you see due diligence and what are the requirements towards businesses. We are definitely striving for that, but on the other hand, I definitely have to stress, if we didn't have the approach by the French government with the Loi de Vigilance in 2017, we wouldn't have been at that stage, not in Germany and not on Commission level. So in parts, it is really necessary that the bigger member states really come up with their approaches and, give a push to the others and also to the European level. So again, and I said, I'm a strong supporter of a smart mix. And in that regard, it's a smart mix as well. So member states should come up with their ideas, but I think we're on a good stage right now that the European Commission can take over. And I think that was also a wake-up call for the European Commission that two of the biggest members, France and Germany, stood up for a binding legislation and for the smart mix. Because, and that's one thing that I would like to add, the voluntary efforts that I was actually referring to since 2013, they were good, and we will definitely follow on them, and we will support voluntary measures. But our lessons learned was that we actually failed with only voluntary measures. The smart mix needs a binding regulation, and this is that's what I was referring to. We're sort of closing the loop and bringing this very important piece of the puzzle, the binding regulation, besides all the voluntary measures that we will definitely be working on in the future as well. We will support businesses. We won't leave them alone with complying with their due diligence. I just want to manage expectations. This is a due diligence act that refers to businesses, and we have to look at the direct impacts that business action has. And we have included also 2 environmental acts within our due diligence act, but we shouldn't put all the expectations into one law. There are many different environmental laws that should be taken into account. And I know it's a pretty German approach to look for the Swiss Army knife and to put everything into one law. But again, it's a smart mix, and I'm pretty sure, and we will strive for that definitely as a development actor, to put more environmental aspects, maybe in other laws, in other regulations, and in other smart mix measures, in order to even more complete the smart mix. So it's a very good question. So that's why we very much pushed that the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights very much have a social aspect, but we definitely need in order the environmental aspects, and there we came up with the OECD guidelines, and I would like to bring up the OECD on the stage as well, with very good guidelines for businesses when it comes to environmental aspects. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're not fighting for environmental standards in a more binding framework on other stages, but not in the Due Diligence Act, although we have a lot of aspects inside, but I don't think we should overburden one law in that regard.
And I'll start by saying that I'm frustrated because this is an industry, as we've already heard, that has a very difficult environmental impact. It is still the butt of accusations of long working hours, mistreatment of women in the workplace, poor wages, and so on and so forth. Yet it's also an industry that has a global footprint, is often the first place that young women go for a job in the formal sector, often out of a rural context or a peri-urban context. And it should be a positive story about global trade and the good that trade can do, but it isn't. And also frustrated, if you like, that some of the progress we'd hoped we've seen over the last 5, 6, 7 years has not been there, although there has been some progress, so we need to acknowledge that as well. So what role does transparency and accountability play in this, and what are our thoughts on that? We look across various different supply chains, so it's not just apparel and textiles, it's also food and manufactured goods. And of course, supply chains have become very dispersed and very vast and very deep. That means that we're often reaching into political and social context where even if there are good laws and policies in place, not always, they're not always implemented. And the checks and balances that we might see in more developed economies and more developed countries, checks and balances around media or civil society, are often not strong enough to compete with the forces of trade and economics. And in the last 5+ years, we've seen many of those actors actually under significant pressure, whether they're trade union activists, whether they're local NGOs, really narrowing that space for them to play a role to hold local business to account and to inform the debate around global business. So we're clearly at a tipping point when, as Anosha said, relying on some of the mechanisms we've had before, either existing laws or indeed voluntary initiatives, is not delivering the impact that we want to see. So we think that transparency is part of the solution. It's not a solution to everything in and of itself. It's also good business. Actually, how can you deliver on the commitments to your consumers around sustainability and around responsible behavior if you don't know the conditions under which things are being made, or the components that go into it, or indeed the raw materials that are part of your product? So for responsible businesses, we think that transparency is not just a desirable factor, but a necessary one. And we've seen this with lots of examples. But we have to be clear also, accountability should run along the supply chain. It's not just the lead firm that is accountable for everything that happens. Employers are responsible for their employees. So fostering good behavior at each point in the supply chain, fostering open and transparent relationships, fostering the confidence to actually reveal that sometimes issues happen and they need to be addressed, is a change in approach, again, from that compliance approach, which tends to drive a lack of engagement, a lack of openness, and a lack of transparency. So although we need to put pressure on the lead firm, the way we put that pressure on the lead firm matters, in that it should drive open and transparent conversations along the supply chain. Abba will be able to talk to that from a Bangladesh perspective.
How does
very
this
eloquently.
transparency look like at the ground level, especially from a Bangladeshi context? If we take it a very high level data, the industry in Bangladesh is almost 30+ years old now. But even after 30 years, we are struggling to map the industry at a very high level. And when we say at a very high level, I mean that how many factories actually have been done? How many workers are working in these factories? What is the gender ratio? How many male and how many female workers are working in this factory? If you look at different sources, you will get different numbers. So transparency, we are still trying to achieve that high-level transparency so that we can actually have a constructive dialogue with the various stakeholders, and so that we can later break it down at a more individual level. So that has been kind of a challenge over the last 7 or 8 years, especially after the run-up was a tragic when the challenges, when the focus really became, the industry really became the focus of the entire world, and all the discussion started. And even after 8 years, that still the mapping process has been going on, which has been really frustrating for us in the ground who are trying to bring on any kind of sustainable changes.
The point was made about the smart mix, and I think that's relevant. As you can see, there are changes in sourcing markets like Bangladesh, but it could also be Cambodia or Vietnam or many others, where we want to encourage and foster that level of engagement and responsibility. If you see the role that BGMEA has played since the Accord, it's been a much stronger partner in wanting to represent its national position and be part of the solution. So I think that smart mix around private, regulatory, different types of engagement, different types of incentives is exactly the right way to go. And Germany's already playing a leading role, not just in the trade area, but also the development area. So it's great to be able to be part of this conversation, sort of that next horizon of getting that smart mix right. So I think there is an acknowledgement that governments should and can do more, but I think we also need to look at that in the trade context of what barriers are being created and what signals are being sent that prevent them building, for example, good wage structures or allowing for trade unions to operate freely, because it's not, you can't look at that point in isolation. Then Abdul, I don't know if you'd like to comment from a Bangladesh perspective.
Yeah. Just to add, First of all, yes, governments can always do more. Everybody can do more. But if you look at again at the bigger picture, over the years, government has been signatory to most of the ILO conventions. It has been a signatory to most of the international call for actions. But at the same time, we are still a developing country. We don't have this government don't have the resources, intentions, but having the intentions and having the resources are two different things. So it's all about a little bit about identifying where the positive intentions are there, but the lack of resources, albeit financial resource or the technological capacity is still missing, where more help can be given or sort of implement or regulate the laws or the regulations that are already they have signed up for or they're planning to do. So that's where I would say the discussion has to, in the future, we can the more focused discussion that how we can help the government and other regulatory bodies in the country take that next step.
So we know that businesses can benefit financially by encouraging their suppliers to be more sustainable. Sustainability is becoming much more important to businesses today, and it can be a driver for better financing conditions because a sustainable business model might be more resilient and less risky. So the challenge the larger companies have is that only about 20% of the emissions they are responsible for are under their direct control. And they can manage those by reducing the number of cups and papers probably they use and the amount of energy and water they waste, but 80% of their impact sits in their supply chains. So there's, in a way, a supply chain sitting behind any product or even a service. And that's where the bulk of the sustainability impact from my perspective and from our perspective lies, whether that's environmental impact, wasted water, wasted energy, pollution and emissions. And of course, the human sides, as we heard earlier today, social impact, poor working conditions, child labor. We need to manage this better.
So today I'm going to briefly talk about what is the transparency challenge. Talking about transparency is easy. Demanding transparency is easy. Doing something about it, unfortunately, is incredibly difficult. Thankfully, in the year 2021, we have technology on our side. So I'll also share with you how technology can enable companies to build supply chain transparency and make progress. At the end of the day, companies are economically motivated actors. It has to be in their interest to achieve what we want them to do. Whether we like it or not, the apparel sector has an incredibly low digital quotient. It's not an industry that has embraced the use of data. It's not an industry that has incentivized data providers. Manufacturers have been asked to jump through multiple hoops that different buyers or different countries have asked them to do. So the questions to Anosha about how Germany is coordinating with other countries is incredibly relevant. Because if you are a Bangladeshi supplier selling into the US and the UK and France and Germany, realistically, you have 4 sets of requirements you're being asked to meet. There is no consistent set of standards today that the industry has adopted. And that makes life very difficult, both for the demand side and the supply side. Buyers in particular, the reality is the bulk of the buyers do not know their upstream suppliers. Tier 1, where the garments are made, everyone knows. Tier 2, the mills, most people know who they're contracting with, but they don't have evidence of the facilities where the garments are made. And beyond Tier 2, the best leading global brands have some visibility, but incredibly limited. They struggle to collect information. Information comes through in manual ways. It's Excel files, it's PDFs, it's emails, it's multiple languages. So analyzing it, gleaning insights are close to impossible, and validating it is almost impossible to do efficiently. It's costly, it's expensive, and it's cumbersome. Not being transparent, everyone understands, and that stick is what is motivating the bulk of the industry to act. I think our challenge is to make that into an opportunity. How do you use transparency to your advantage with investors, whether it's gaining market share, gaining new partnerships? And that's where Sarai comes in. We are a venture by HSBC. It's not what you would expect a bank to be doing because there's no banking on the platform. The hypothesis behind Sarai started, I ran the global trade finance business for HSBC in London. What's evident is how companies connect with each other, how companies build relationships. It might as well be 1980. Technology has not changed that. It hinges on who you know, traveling all over the world, collecting data in centralized databases, visiting factories, it's duplication. So we are a new venture by HSBC. We've started with one industry, the fashion industry. And we went live at the start of 2019. We are a B2B digital platform that helps companies build trusted relationships by collecting information and sharing information with each other. In less than 2 years that we've been live, we have over 5,700 companies on the platform, all of them from the apparel industry from across 80 countries. And we are growing almost 100% in terms of our users on a quarter-on-quarter basis. What do? We help companies build information on their supply chain, build a digital supply chain. Anosha made a point and she said, the first challenge is to know your supply chain. If you don't know your supply chain, everything else is academic. What does knowing your supply chain mean? And taking a genuinely risk-based approach as to what you need to know, there's some parts of your supply chain where you need to go deep. You need to know exactly what material goes into your product. And you need to be able to prove that. If you are a brand in the US, that is incredibly topical, especially when it comes to cotton. Europe is going to continue and pick up a lot of the same threads. So traceability allows companies to go deep and prove where the raw materials going into their product comes from. Visibility helps you stay on top of your supply chain. The world's largest brands have between 500 to 2,000 suppliers in their chain. Staying on top of those companies, understanding what information you need, getting alerts on that company is incredibly difficult, and Sarai makes that easy. If you look at the footwear industry, you've got manufacturers who are $4 or $5 billion in terms of turnover. If you look at the apparel industry, it's a lot more fragmented. Transparency can drive the industry one of two ways. It can drive the industry to really heavy consolidation, where the largest players win, or it can drive to democratization, where you have a lot of fragmentation in terms of supply. The reality is today, we have excess supply in the market, especially in a COVID world, there is excess supply. So I think the world is going to move to one of those two directions. Your bet is as good as mine as to where it goes. And I think it depends on what the leaders do. If the leaders take the charge, I think it will drive consolidation. If the leaders don't, and the smaller players use transparency, use sustainability to differentiate. If you are a brand based in Germany, looking for a new supplier in Bangladesh, you will undoubtedly pick the supplier who's the most transparent. Good quality product at a competitive price, shipped on time, that's expected. That's not a differentiator anymore. Transparency, information on where your product is made, information on the ESG credentials of your suppliers will be a differentiator. So that's what we've been advocating to manufacturers is embrace this challenge and use it to get on the front foot, because that's what will set you apart.
At Hess Natur, we have sustainability at our core. Yeah, it was the reason for our founder to found the company. We're a German-based fair fashion brand and a pioneer for sustainable fashion and innovation for over 45 years now. So we strongly support the supply chain law because we see human rights and environmental rights as non-negotiable. And that's why we also would appreciate a law for all company sizes instead of only the big ones. And it's also because, according to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and other well-respected and known scientists and reports, we only have 1 decade now to take action and to turn around.
Thanks very much, Monica. First of all, inviting me. It's very interesting so far. And I must say I fully support kind of the efforts of the government and of private entities to push forward with the supply chain law. I think those companies that see it rather as a cost than an opportunity. And I'd like to Vivek's slide on that, where you had the risk kind of that is often being emphasized without the kind of opportunities being properly evaluated. They tend to be more difficult to be evaluated, but I think that's very key. And I think those companies who emphasize the cost over the opportunities will, in the longer run, be worse off. And yes, there is a cost to introducing the measures that have been proposed, for sure. I think all the ones from the business side will agree with that, but kind of the benefits will be great in terms of having a better risk map of your supply chain, which can also be helpful in the case of disruptions, right? So we currently do a project in terms of how we could use AI to proactively manage disruptions. If you know your supply chain, if you have the right data, then you can more quickly react in case of a disruption. And I think that's yet another benefit of actually knowing your supply chain. And I think the key term really that has been mentioned a number of times is transparency and trust. And I'm delighted to see technology options that are being promoted in order to foster this transparency. But obviously, as Peter and Nabil pointed out, that's not the whole story yet. We need to have kind of behavioral adaptations as well. We need to more carefully think about where do we need to establish regulation. We need to really educate the consumer about what the impact of their buying decisions is. Which is currently, I don't think is the case, right? Like I do teach sustainability in supply chain courses. You've been there as guest speakers, and I think nowadays students are willing to base their decisions on what's happening in the supply chain in terms of social standards, in terms of environmental standards. But as yet, the consumer is not very well informed about the huge footprint that the fashion industry has, and also about the differences in terms of different companies, different retailers, different supply chains in terms of their carbon footprint. And I think that's yet another benefit of transparency, that then the consumer will be better able to base their purchase decisions on what is the carbon footprint, what is the adherence to social standards when I buy a new t-shirt.
When Rana Plaza happened, I did a bit of research, and back in 1912 in New York, there was a fire at a factory. And if you've been to New York, many of the buildings have those sort of iron staircases that hang off the sides or the backs, and they're a result of law that was brought in after that fire, where 112 women were killed. And the parallels were quite stark. It was a smaller number, thank goodness, but it was mostly women. It was women working in a building that wasn't fire safe. It was working at a low cost end, and so on and so forth. So to an extent, we've come through a circle. From that time, most garments were still made in the northern Western hemisphere, and over time, better regulations, unionization, health and safety, and so forth, conditions improved. If you go more than through 50s, 60s and 70s, as that industry started to look for cheaper places to make clothes, typically out to Southeast Asia and in the global South, you start to see that production then happening in areas where those checks and balances aren't in place. The laws either aren't there or are not implemented, civil society checks and balances, trade unionism, so forth. So we've almost gone through a cycle where this is an industry which inherently is about bringing on relatively unskilled, it's unfair to say unskilled, relatively unskilled labor into the workforce. In a factory, it's very price conscious, and you need checks and balances to make sure conditions are good. Those were in place for some time, but as the industry's globalized, we've ended up in places where those checks and balances aren't there. And I think that has led us to a situation, particularly where countries are traded off, suppliers are traded off against each other, and we're offered forever cheaper, better offers. And there is no, and I think somebody already said it, may have been you, Vivek, the market mechanism fails. There is no feedback loop that's effectively saying, actually, we can't produce at this price, and pay a decent tax and pay someone proper wages and have a safe factory and so forth. So actually you get breakdown of market signals, if you like the social market signals, which should theoretically sort of push back against these lower conditions. So you've seen that power imbalance. I'm really sad to say, equally, some of the global institutions, including the World Bank, have said, and I quote, "Come to Ethiopia because wages are low," unquote. So you've also had a misguided idea that if you can base an industry on low wages rather than decent work and decent opportunities, you would find the situation that we now see. So it's multi-layered, multifaceted. It is partly law, partly power, and partly history.
If we are always in the pursuit for cheaper labor, that comes with baggage. And so I think the industry, the price points at which, and it depends on how far ahead you want to pass the buck, but if consumers only want to pay X dollars for a t-shirt, at the end of the day, that's going to involve cutting corners, and the economics just don't stack up.
We are working and operate sustainably since 45 years. Yeah, that's the core of our business, as I said. So Heinz Hess, the founder of Hess Natur, was one of the initiators of the first organic cotton growing project. Yeah, we've signed, as the first German brand, we've signed the MOU for the Fairer Foundation in Germany. Yeah, we've signed the Textile Bündnis, we're part of the Grüne Knopf, etc. pp. Yeah, just to give you a broad view on how we work and what we do. And innovation, we actually see sustainability as innovation. Yeah, so sustainability is not something you reach once and then it's done. Yeah, it's always moving and it's always evolving, and innovation is part of it. Yeah, so like, for example, the organic cotton was an innovation at that time. Founding Hess Natur, really specializing on natural fibers without harmful chemicals, was innovation at that time. And now we're taking it into the fashion nowadays. So, for example, denims, to produce them really in a sustainable manner wasn't possible for us, and according to our standards, for quite a while. Yeah, but now we work with our partners and now it's possible. Yeah, just to give you an example. And I think Vivek already said it. Yeah, I think it is so important, and I can't stress it enough. Yeah, that there is a price to sustainability, but there is always a price. Yeah, because if the production is unsustainable and we have cheap prices and cheap production, then still someone pays the price. Yeah. It's always like that. Someone always has to pay the price. And also, you know, I think you ask it, so is it unfair for us? Yeah, I would like to broaden the view. Yeah, it's not really unfair for us, but it's unfair for the people who suffer from these kind of practices, and it is unfair for future generations, yeah, because it's about their future. What we're doing right now, unsustainable practices, yeah, is on the back of their future. So, and at the end of the day, really, it's about our future for all of us.